Okay, so post-revolution and creating our new government. So the first question we have to ask is, was this really a revolution? Because the definition of revolution is in one word, change. But how much did change is the question, or was it more just evolution? You know, we have government established very similarly before the war and after. We have a similar monetary system. I mean, what really changed other than who was in charge? So who could vote? Same group that we've been talking about for quite a while, white land-holding whites, but they did reduce the amount of land you had to hold. You can read through some of these as well. Free blacks in America, there were some. They did have a few rights at this point, up until some things are going to change a little bit later. Still treated as second-class citizens. You should check out Benjamin Banneker and his interactions with Thomas Jefferson to see how that all worked out too. We have this idea called Republican motherhood, the idea that women were the keepers of the nation's conscience, that they were supposed to be the moral fiber of America. During the war, states drew up their own new constitutions. Most were bicameral. They had a state bill of rights, a weak executive, and a weak judicial. Weak executive, why? Because they represented the king, so they wanted a weak executive branch. Judicial, because of the admiralty courts we talked about. A lot of the capitals really were moved inland, so from New Bern, North Carolina, to Raleigh, from Charleston to Columbia, Williamsburg to Richmond, because it seemed to represent more of the people instead of just being that coastal wealthy group. The Loyalists, who were promised to keep their lands, eventually did lose them for the most part. They weren't protected. The government that we have, the Articles of the Confederation, is a weak central government. Just couldn't protect them. Also, our trade is going to be hampered because we're no longer protected by the British Navy. But the British are still trading with America even after the war, and they're flooding our markets with their goods because we need them. We were lucky to be blessed with good leaders, especially politically after the revolution. I mean, some of the names you see there are just amazing leaders to have at the right time. Again, if not for this, we may not have been able to keep this country going. So during the war, we created the Articles of the Confederation. This is a confederation of states, sovereign states. So you can look on the Dropbox, and there's something about the Articles that you can watch that really explains this very well. Written by John Dickinson, and establishes a weak central government where the states have more power than the federal government, because we're trying to avoid the whole kingly thing again. The big question was the land out west, because every colony seemed to claim land. There's a worksheet that I sent you again several weeks ago about the Articles and the Northwest Ordinance, where you can see a map that explains this. So states with claims could sell that western land and pay off all their debt. So some states like Massachusetts or Connecticut or Rhode Island couldn't make any claims. They were landlocked. So an agreement was made that, we won't approve these articles unless we're going to give all that land to the national government and let them do what they will. So under the Articles, no executive branch, no judicial branch. There's one house. It's not bicameral like we have today. Each state gets one vote. You can have 100 representatives, but you get one vote for your entire state or colony. Some of the strengths and weaknesses here, they're also listed on the worksheet that I sent you. You can read through these as well. You can't tax, so there's no federal tax. There's no federal regulation of trade, so North Carolina could trade with Britain, while South Carolina said, no, that's a bad idea. The federal government had to ask for volunteers for the Army. They had to ask for tax money. A couple of good things that do come out of the Articles deal with land. First is the Land Ordinance, and the other is the Northwest Ordinance, which again you have the worksheet on. This basically set a way for new states to enter the Union. The British, we still have problems with them. They had forts in the Northwest Territory, which is going to be current Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, and they were supposed to leave, but they didn't. They're still getting the Indians riled up to mess with us as well. The Spanish controlled the Mississippi River, which was a huge trading route, especially if you lived down on the frontier. The French said, hey, we lent you all this stuff. We want that money back. We had pirates attacking us in the Mediterranean Sea. We're a weak country. We don't have a navy to speak of, and we can't defend ourselves. So these guys are basically sitting back in Europe saying, okay, we'll just wait and bide our time till this country falls apart, and then we'll swoop in and fight over it or take it over. This happens, which scares a lot of people, Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays was a veteran farmer, and he was upset at taxation by his state. So he's going to organize these farmers. They're going to march on the courthouse, because the courthouse was taking away their land, people being taken to court. Farmers had borrowed a lot of money and couldn't pay it back. Now, this is eventually put down, but it scared people, especially the conservative leaders. You know, these rebellions can't happen. Who's going to put them down? Who's going to control this mob? Even George Washington said this quote down here, you know, triumph for our enemies. We can't even govern ourselves. Now, despite all that, things for the middle and southern colonies seem to be getting better. The prices are getting better for their goods. They're exporting, they're trading, but New England was having less support and less luck. And this is the minority group calling for a stronger government. So we have a minority push for the rebellion and minority push for the change of government. The conservatives themselves really fear the loss of their money, their possessions, and they want a strong central government to protect that. Your average person probably favored the states' rights under the Articles of the Confederation. So some would say there was a propaganda movement to make things appear worse than it really was to get people to support this new government. You have a convention, only 5 states came. So Hamilton says, okay, let's go to Philadelphia and just revise these articles. Remember, this meeting is only supposed to revise the articles. What they end up doing is chunking the articles and coming up with the United States Constitution. So you have this convention, everybody but Rhode Island sent delegates at first, and we don't know a lot about it because no written record was kept of what happened. It was people writing after the fact. It was all secret. You had armed guards. They didn't want any influence from anybody. Excuse me. And we're going to end up creating a whole new form of government. James Madison did a lot of the work on this. He's called father of the Constitution. So in this convention, who's going to be the chairman? Who's the one guy everybody seems to trust? Washington. What's also important about this in our country is that the leaders of the Revolution did not create the new government. The leaders of the Revolution were gone. They were in Europe, or they weren't selected to attend as representatives. So you had a liberal, well, not liberal, let's say you had a rebellious group pushing for change for the Revolution, but you have a conservative group creating the government. There you go. Radicals led the Revolution. You can read through this. We're going to copy some of the British ideas like a Bill of Rights. And we have these 2 plans that are being debated. The Virginia plan or the big state plan, where this guy says we want to have bicameral federal government based on representation of the people, checks and balances. So the big states would favor this because they would get more representatives. I have 200 people in my colony, so I get more representatives rather than Rhode Island, who has 20 people, for example. You know those numbers are just made up. The other plan was the New Jersey plan. We're going to say we're going to have 1 house and every state gets 1 vote. So if you're small, you like that. And the Constitution is the highest law of the land. And Congress has power to tax, trade, armies, etc. So a compromise came up. Roger Sherman comes up with this great compromise where we have what we have today, the Senate and the House of Representatives for legislative branch. The House is based on population, and the Senate is based on every state gets 2 no matter when you come in or how big or small you are. There is a video on the Dropbox. It's labeled video playback, but it's about the Constitution, how it was created. That's a great one to view. There's also one on the Electoral College you should view to understand this stuff if you don't. So we're going to have a strong executive branch. We're going to have an indirect election of the president, the Electoral College, which many people say is outdated and needs to be done away with, which I agree should have been done away with 50 years ago. We also have to deal with slavery. Are slaves going to count as property, or are they going to count as people when it comes to representation? They came to a compromise. Slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation. Another blight on our government. We come up with a lot of agreements commercially. We want sound money, etc. Congress can regulate interstate and foreign trade, but not exports. So, we have our government set up. If you don't understand how the Constitution works, you may want to check it out, read through the AMSco. You know, we have 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial. Article 1, 2, 3 deal with those. Article 1 is legislative. They thought that was the most important. 2, executive, 3, judicial. You can read through this information as well. There's also a video on the Dropbox site about how a bill becomes a law. You can see that on Schoolhouse Rock. So in this case, the federal government is going to have more power than the state government. None of the 13 states have to approve it. Eventually it was approved. State conventions had to ratify this, but you're going to have 2 groups, those who support it and those who don't. This is another video you can watch on the Dropbox site, very informative. So if you're a Federalist, you want these things. And 4 states very quickly say, yes, we will approve it. Anti-Federalist, these are the things you're concerned about, especially a Bill of Rights to protect your individual and personal rights. Generally, these are the areas that the Anti-Federalists had strongholds and Federalist areas. You can see it's a hodgepodge here. Massachusetts, who seemed to be the leader of the rebellion, the leader of the resistance, has to approve this if it's going to work. And they had a lot of Anti-Federalists in their group. But an agreement was made. They said, look, if we prove this, you have to add a Bill of Rights. And eventually, after a close vote, it was approved. Virginia also had to approve. Very strong Anti-Federalist group, but a major player in the Revolution. You had very strong Anti-Federalist leaders like these guys here, but then you also had great Federalist leaders like Washington, Madison, John Marshall, who become the first well, not the first, but who become a Supreme Court justice. Basically, these states begin to realize we can't survive as an independent state. We can't have the United States and then the country of Virginia, for example. And they begin to join. New York was also very fierce Anti-Federalist groups. The main Federalist there was Alexander Hamilton, and he, along with Jay and Madison, began to publish a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, and they just numbered them, and they each dealt with different things. They didn't have a lot of influence outside of New York, but they were able to help provide information on why we should support this Constitution. You can read through that. The Anti-Federalists just didn't have the figures. They didn't have a Washington-like figure. They didn't have support of a lot of the newspapers who were pro-Constitution or the experience of their counterparts at the national level. They also didn't make it seem like, holy cow, if we don't get rid of this Constitution, everything's going to fall apart. So they didn't have this urgency. So eventually the Constitution is approved. You can go to this link on the website and it'll take you to a flashcard stack where you can compare Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Good for review. You can see that we were one of the last states to approve it. You can read this as well. All right, that is it.